I'm going to talk about is another way that you can actually get students more engaged in the classroom, which is called, general method is called peer instruction. And I found it to be pretty easy to implement, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk a little bit about it, because if you're thinking about doing more active learning activities and strategies in your classroom, this is something you might want to consider. Wanted to say just a couple words about why would you actually want to promote active learning in the classroom. This may be obvious to some people, but it wasn't obvious to me when I was starting to evaluate some of these ideas. And since I'm a physicist, I like to make analogies. And the analogy I like to make with teaching and learning is through the interaction of light and matter, or with the interaction of light and matter. So there's three main methods that light can interact with matter. First one you can think is transmission. So essentially the light from outside is going through glass, and it's coming into the room, and that's the transmission of light. If you think of the situation of teaching and learning, is this what we want to happen with our students? There's a phrase that I'm sure everybody's probably familiar with. What does this look like? In one ear, out the other, right? So that's not what you want to happen when you're in a situation where one students to learn. But for sure it does happen. The next way light can interact with matter is through reflection. And I'm sure we've all experienced this where we've had students that can perform very well on a test. They seem to have demonstrated that they understand something. Then you ask them a question 3 weeks later, and it's like they've just jettisoned all the knowledge that they had out of their head, and for some reason they no longer understand what you thought they understood. So again, not exactly what we want to happen in the situation of teaching and learning. And then what I would argue what you really want to happen is similar to the absorption of light, where the light is absorbed and then there's an internal change in the system somehow. Okay, so the question is, how do we get this to occur with knowledge and skills? And the idea of active learning is based on the premise that learning most effectively takes place when students can construct their own knowledge, of course under proper guidance. And there's a pretty big body of knowledge and evidence developed over the past few decades that indicates that the best way to do this is through getting the students to actively participate in the classroom. Not to say that conventional lectures aren't effective in teaching, but the general understanding now, I think, is that active learning is more effective. Okay. So when I first started here at Oregon Tech, I would say my first year of teaching, I had a pretty traditional style of teaching. I had the traditional lecture. I basically sat in front of the class. I did examples. I provided the information. And then after starting to read into physics education literature, I started to realize that that was not really what I wanted to be doing. So I started thinking, how could I actually incorporate active learning into my own teaching? And there are lots of ways you can imagine doing this. There's things like called process-oriented guided inquiry learning, local cooperative learning exercises where you have students work in groups on some sort of extended task like problem solving, just-in-time teaching, which Joe just
like you have a,
next thing you can do things like Think, Pair, Share. Something called Workshop Studio Physics is more specifically related to physics. And then there's, and these are just some examples, not exhaustive list. And then peer instruction was the thing that I decided to actually try to implement. So I won't talk about these other active learning strategies, but I'll talk about peer instruction. So, basic structure of how this works. This was developed by Eric Mazur, who's a professor at Harvard University. It's not new. He's been developing this for like 20 years now. So there's a lot of stuff out there that you can look at to learn more about this. And he's still working on this, still publishing papers about new ways to implement the basic structure is instructor poses a question. And it's usually some sort of a conceptual question. It's usually multiple choice. The students are allowed to independently think about the question for a minute or two, and this is usually done quietly by themselves. And then after you give them the time to digest and think about the question, you ask them to respond. And you can either do this with these sort of ABC flashcards, or you can use clickers if you have them available, electronic clickers. And then students are, after they respond first with what they think the answer is, then they are asked to convince the person next to them that their answer is correct. This usually takes 2 or 3 minutes, or sometimes what I do now actually is in members of a smaller group have this discussion. And then you ask them to again respond with the cards after discussing it. And the nice thing is if things go the way you would like them to, the percentage of correct answers often increases after the discussion. And actually I had a nice thing happen the other day, which was really cool, was that nobody had the correct answer on the first response. They discussed it, and then maybe about half the people had the right answer afterwards. So even though none of them started with the correct answer, the process of discussion actually got them to think about it, and somehow they led themselves to the right answer. And then finally, the instructor usually provides some kind of an explanation, summary, recap, maybe their perspective, how they would think about the question. So you notice that that's one thing, is that that's provided after the students think about it, not before. And there is a book that is now several years old, but this was what I used when I started implementing this in my classes. This book is primarily based in the context of physics, but still has some nice introduction to the technique, and there's lots of stuff here on our professor's website you can look at. You can request papers that can email to you. You ask on the website, type in your email address and it will be sent to you. Okay, so I think the best way to illustrate how this works in practice is for you guys to do physics. So what I did is I brought, everybody's getting scared. Well, not you.
I'm in.
And so what this will require is for you to have somebody to talk to, so you have to come to somebody over here. And I was nice, our department chair was nice enough, Rose was nice enough to pay for all these cards to be printed and laminated. When I first did this, I just had cardstock and I cut them into fours, and then, but I got really tired of erasing obscenities the students were penciling in under the cards every year, so I decided, hey, I'm going to go for the high quality laminated cards. I'm done with that. So, okay, so this is an example. This is actually I call these things quick tests. Eric Mazur calls them concept tests. You can call them whatever you want. But this is an example that I pulled from the first term of introductory physics, general physics with calculus. Essentially, one of the first things we do is look at how do you describe objects that are moving. And so the students are introduced to concepts like position, velocity, speed, acceleration, and also how to mathematically describe motion and graphically describe motion. So this is a graph of position of two different objects as a function of time. So the position of the object is changing with time. And the students by now have been introduced to the concept that the slope of a position versus time graph is the velocity, and the speed of the object is the absolute value of velocity. So the question is, when is the speed of object A equal to the speed of object B, according to this graph? 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, or do they not have the same speed for any of the times shown? So I'll let you think about it for a minute. Don't be afraid to answer wrong. The hardest thing for the instructor is to get the students enough time to think about it, because they always need more time to think about it than you think.
Me too. Like, it was just so fun.
Okay, so what do you guys think? What? Okay, so now, as in the next step of the process, turn to your neighbor and try to convince them why your answer is correct, or that your answer is correct.
I have no idea. Well, he said the slopes. Yeah. The stuff. slopes and never be. Then the speeds are not right, so it's fully apart because the slope of the I don't know. Really use it. That's where the lines go, right? So it's because they use the water distance.
Okay, and so then after discussion, what do you guys think? What would be the most reasonable response?
Ooh, Sean, not convinced.
Sean changed his answer from a wrong answer to another wrong. I don't do that in class, just so you know. But I know Sean must know the right answer.
Yes.
He's just giving me a hard time. So the answer, and then this instruction provides the answer. So the answer is D. They don't have the same speed for any of the times shown. If the slope of the graph is a measure of the speed, the slopes of the two graphs are constant. Of the two curves are constant, and they're always different at all times. This might be, so it looks like everybody got the idea. But students actually, when they're first taking physics for the first time, they look at this graph and you'd be surprised how many actually think that the speed of the objects are the same too, because they're still working with how do I interpret what this graph is really telling me, not just what the quantities mean. So it's useful to go through this exercise. Here's another example, but I think you guys get the idea of how it works. I won't go through this example, but another example. So you could do progressively a little bit more challenging questions. Do you guys want to do this one? Okay, why don't we do this one?
I have a quick question. The problem before, do you actually show like a visual of motion of how that actually
Good question.
follow through?
Yeah, so what I do is as we're doing this, we introduce things called motion diagrams. Motion diagrams are a way of representing objects as they're moving, sort of a snap frame or a stop frame moving. So, example, if I'm dropping an object, I would show the position of the object at equal increments of time, since it's accelerating, the distances become greater that it travels in a given amount of time. And then, so we're introducing a lot of these things at once. There's many different representations that I use at least in my physics classes to think about it. Yeah.
So Matt, if I had got that one wrong by answering B, because that's when the lines are equal,
Yes.
how do you go about correcting that misconception?
Well, you can't. I don't think you can expect to correct everyone's misconception at every single time. At least that's my approach. What you can do is hopefully through the discussion with the student, you mean after the second time if they're still having the wrong answer. There's not any way I don't have time to sort of address each individual misconception. But what I think and I hope is that the discussion helps correct some of those misconceptions. And so after the discussion, more of the students are thinking about it, at least, or starting to shift the way they're thinking about it to the correct way of thinking about it.
So Matt, along the same lines, Sean and I were talking, I could probably write a really convincing argument as to why the answer is D, but not really know the correct answer. So how do you avoid that problem, where the student may convince the other student that the answer is D, and the answer is D, but they're not giving the right reason?
Again, yeah, it's sort of one of these things you can't expect to, this is sort of a challenge in teaching in general, right? You can't expect that every student will leave your classroom with the understanding that you want them. But you can do things in your teaching that will promote that understanding the best that you can. So it's definitely not, there's no sort of, I don't think anybody's come up with a silver bullet of instructional pedagogy. That's sort of like, do this, your students will just, they will do what you want them to do, to learn what you want them to learn. But I think, in my opinion at least, it helps. And it gives them an opportunity to calibrate what they're thinking, how they're thinking about it relative to how the neighbor's thinking about it. And yeah, it's just sometimes you see students go from the correct answer to the incorrect. I've seen this happen. They had the correct answer to begin with, and then second time you ask them, they have the incorrect answer. But so obviously, they're not confident about how they're thinking about it, obviously. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Do you have like several kind of related questions? Do you show them one that is correct? So that they do see that, like these are related, so, you know. If you
Yes.
So that then you say, so that.
Well, I give them the correct
they
answer for
understand
this, and then, for example, this is the next question I ask. And so, and I won't, we'll skip actually going through this, but, you know, this question is asking again, when is the speed of the object A equal to the speed of object B? Knowing that it's the slope of the curve that determines the speed, what do you
So
guys
you
think?
throw in the theory then.
Yeah, so if you look at this, this will be at 2 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
So here, the two speeds are equal at 2 seconds.
So then once they see the example.
You're gonna get mad at me after,
Right, then they can go back to the first one and say, okay, now I understand where the difference is.
Probably, yeah. I would say
That's what
say
we're
this.
hoping.
So everybody sort of see the idea how this works.
Let me get some of this down first.
So just a few, just to say a few things on why I chose this particular method as a first foray, so speaking into trying to incorporate active learning in my classes. One is that you don't have to totally go away from a standard lecture format in order to do this. As you can imagine, you can sort of sprinkle these questions throughout your lecture. You can lecture for 10 or 15 minutes. You can pose a question that is actually related to what you just lectured on.
I know it's
You
on
can lecture again
campus.
for another 15 minutes and do the same.
No,
So you don't have to completely redesign your course or the classroom structure or anything like that, which was really appealing to me because some of these techniques of active learning take a lot of structural redesign of your course, and that can be kind of intimidating. Allows students to learn and teach each other through social interaction, and a lot of power, learning from one's peers. There's different reasons I think that's true. One, how many people have learned the material that they teach better through teaching the course?
That was color nine.
I think we could all experience that. So even the students who actually understand it probably pretty well from the level of the students, the process of them having to try to explain it to somebody else is really useful. And there's another benefit, I think, of having students teaching each other is that the way students talk to each other is different than the way instructors talk to each other. And so they use language that probably makes a little more sense to other students than maybe the way that I might choose to explain something. So there's some benefit there. Flashcards can be used, so this is really inexpensive, doesn't require any software prep. You use clickers. A lot of the clicker software requires that you create the questions ahead of time in the software. I tried this once and it's kind of time consuming. And also just to note that there have been studies that show that flashcards are just as effective as clickers as far as their usage of flashcards. And also provides the instructor with feedback, which is really important because you can instantly see how students are understanding the material. And also the students themselves, gives them a way to test as you're going. Question, does it help? The short answer is yes. And so there's lots of, Eric Kruger has lots of papers that provide evidence. I won't go through all that, but if you're interested, you can look at this website. There's lots of research results that indicate themselves. I will say, in my own experience, evaluating how effective it is in your own course is really difficult because anytime you change something, you can't just say, okay, well, how well did my students do on exams in previous term? How well are they doing now? Right? Because you need to really calibrate for what the students, how they, what their mind state or their educational level or anything was when they came in. And there's lots of factors that you need to control for, so you really have to design an evaluation that's well designed, meaningful statistics, and all this stuff is difficult to do. So you kind of have to go on faith that if the research shows that it works, it's worthwhile doing. That's what I've been mine. But one thing you can do is get feedback, and this is kind of similar to what Joe had shown for the stuff that he was doing with Jason teaching. You know, do students think that it helps? And what I've gathered, this was from the first
grab
one
stuff
that
on the way out.
most of the students thought that it was either helping a little bit or helping a lot. So, few considerations. The process, as you can see, it takes at least 5 minutes to do one of these questions, roughly. So if you do 3 of them, that's already 15 minutes of class time. So it takes up a considerable amount of class time depending on how much you do, but it might be worth it. And because that something has to go, if you're incorporating something new, then what usually ends up going is presentation of basic material, things like definitions, things that the students can likely get on from reading the text outside of class. So that places a more important responsibility on the student to read ahead and come to class with basic understanding of basic knowledge of subject matter, which again, I don't think is a bad thing. And some students are shy, not very social, and so there's not much you can do about that, at least not much I've tried to do about that, but most students do like to discuss the questions and work through the reasoning. And then last thing that I find is that constructing useful questions is a bit of an art. Luckily, I have a lot of resources like those ones that I showed. I did not create, I actually stole them from their reserve book. So but you have to kind of think what questions do I want to ask, because the most useful questions are the ones that target things that you know students have trouble with. So if you have any understanding from your own teaching, from previous courses, or from the literature that students really, you know, for example, students in physics really have a difficult time differentiating between acceleration and velocity. So this is something that's known. So I can create questions that really target that specific misconception or difficulty that they have. So it is a bit of that. So that's all I brought. Happy to answer more questions.
Matt, with the flashcard thing, every time I've tried something like this, I feel like the kids get in the mindset of just picking any guess because it really doesn't matter and hard to get them to do it. And every time I've had them work stuff out on pencil and paper, then they try to put more effort into it. Do you have any ideas of how you could bridge the gap so they take the questions kind of more seriously?
I guess in my experience, I haven't noticed that problem. So I mean, there are students definitely that are more engaged naturally than others. But even the students who are not engaged, at least my impression or my perception is that they are usually at least trying to actively think about the problem. One thing, they do know that they're going to have to discuss it with the people around them. I think that aspect of it can help because, you know you're going to have to enter a discussion with somebody about it, you'll probably at least think about it a little bit so that you will sound somewhat intelligent when you have to talk about it with your neighbor. But yeah, so like Think, Pair, Share is a related activity, which I think might bridge that gap. So what people often do with Think, Pair, Share is you have them think about it, and then you actually have them write down something, and then you can have them discuss it, share what they've written with the person next to them. So, yeah. You can imagine hybriding many of these things together and using concert.
So do you have a set of cards that you bring to class every day?
I do. I actually keep them in the stock room next to the physics lab, but yeah, basically this box of cards is just sitting there, and then I pass them out. And in me, you get a better system where I have different tables, and so a set of cards for each table. But yeah, that's basically what I do. So it costs like less than $100 to have these printed on cardstock and laminated.
Well, thank you so much.
Not so much a question, but a comment. I've attended lots of active learning presentations. And it infuriates me when they're talking about active learning, but they just stand up there and talk the whole time.
I'm glad that you incorporated some active learning into your active learning presentation.
I think I'll take that as a compliment.
Yes, yes.
It's difficult. I have to admit, I'm kind of stuck at a point where this was pretty easy to implement. I'm trying to think about what do I do next to make. And I know some things other people do. Seth Anthony does a lot of worksheet kind of things. I'm kind of leaning toward doing that. Sort of collaborative problem solving stuff.
So Matt, you use these more for like the conceptual part of the physics, but when you get to the quantitative stuff, you don't do the multiple choice?
Yeah, mostly. But one thing I will say that I also do some things where it's not just multiple choice. So from the engineers that we have in here, if I can say free body diagram, you'll know what free body diagram is. But there are things. So a free body diagram is a common diagram that you have to draw to identify forces on an object. Okay, so there's no computations that they need to do, but what I do is I have them each draw a free body diagram, and then rather than responding with response cards, I just say, okay, now compare your free body diagram with the people on their side, and then I draw my own free body diagram, and then you compare it, so that there's ways you can do it with calculations too, but most of the multiple choice is conceptual. Which in physics actually is in some ways the hardest part, because the part that students have are most difficult. They can solve a problem and calculate something, but I have no idea what they're calculating. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the CCT for the invitation.
Yes, thank you so much.